The world has changed, leading many to question the future of the economy and their personal finances. Burton understands the changing dynamics of the market and the economic realities facing our communities. No one can predict the future, but having an advisor that maximizes your tax advantages and helps achieve your financial goals can lead to greater stability. Let Burton's accountants and advisors help protect you, your family, and your business. Burton LLP. We listen, we solve, we do.
Good morning and welcome to Brooklyn 2.0, background on the city's most populated and booming borough. My name is Max Gross. I'm the editor-in-chief of Commercial Observer, and I am very pleased to be joined today by two living legends. Aaron Chen of ODA, one of the great architects, and Elliot Spitzer, former governor of New York and head of Spitzer Enterprises. Before we get started, I did want to thank our sponsor, Burton LLP. Before I get into questions, I know that Aaron, you wanted to start us off a little with a little bit about what we're going to be talking about today.
Yes, good morning, everyone. Hey, Max, good to see you. Elliot, pleasure to be here today. Thanks for the introduction. I thought we could start off with a few beautiful images. I'm going to share my screen for a second. And this is a fruit of the recent collaborations between Elliot's company and mine. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Absolutely.
And since we're going to talk about Brooklyn, about Williamsburg, and about the waterfront developments, I just wanted to share 420 Kent Avenue, those sort of beautiful three towers on the East River in Williamsburg, right by the bridge, are actually two buildings. The northern one and the south two are sharing a lobby. And I always, say the amount of apartments, and I'm being corrected by Elliot. So I'm going to let him describe how many units are there.
857.
There you go. 857. A few very important elements that I think we would like to discuss today. One is the way that the building contributes to the public realm, and the way that the gap between them and the waterfront has been developed to become an accessible public waterfront park. The idea of buildings as contributors to the public realm is something that makes, I think, Brooklyn stronger and stronger, and especially the waterfront development. Maybe the architectural character of the buildings that was inspired by the urge to maximize views, which are gorgeous, to Manhattan, and also expand the amount of outdoor spaces for apartments. And then the sort of monolithic curtain wall that together we decided to use as a sculptural element. As a sculptural element on the waterfront that kind of breaks the scale of otherwise kind of simple gestures of small windows. The apartments, enjoy the corner views. Almost every apartment living room has a corner window to the views, and then the vast expanse of amenities that are kind of simply designed, again, echoes the amazing exposure to the river and to the views. We're very proud for these buildings. This is the courtyard that splits the the connection lobby between the two lobbies and bring natural light. So the entire experience is very light and airy and full of engagement with outdoor landscape. Quite beautiful stair that leads you to the upper terrace that you see here. And in a way, the reflection duality between the monumental architectural glory of Manhattan to this building and others that are being built on the waterfront in Brooklyn maybe suggests the new position, the new power, the new statue of Brooklyn as it stands across from Manhattan as a city of its own. That the reflection of both sides of the river starts to connect this type of duality. And it's been pleasure to do this in collaboration with Elliot and his team. It takes creativity on so many different levels to get stuff like this done. And I hope that could just generate the beginning of our conversation.
Ron, I just want to add one thing. Those are great pictures. Can you send them to me? I need those.
Eran, that's a perfect starting point to jump off on this conversation. So, Elliot, let me ask you, why Brooklyn? Spitzer has been around for years. You guys have done so much in Manhattan. What was the thing that appealed to you about Brooklyn?
Well, look, first, I appreciate the invitation and want to echo what Eran said, actually turn it back to him a bit. He designed a spectacular set of buildings. And I think, as you can well imagine, the creativity and the aesthetics of this are his and his ingenuity. And so hats off to him. I think he really created something there that adds to the skyline of New York, the Brooklyn side of the East River. And so I really want to, as I said, doff my cap to Eran for that. We have been around as a development company for decades. My dad began in the 1950s, primarily in Manhattan. You are correct. But we value the city in its entirety. My dad built a number of buildings earlier in his career up in the Bronx and on Grand Concourse and in Riverdale, while sort of the larger buildings had been in Manhattan, whether it's on Fifth Avenue or the Corinthian on First Avenue. We are proud and participants in the entire city. And not to harken back to my career in government, I loved not only Manhattan, every borough and the entirety of the state. And Brooklyn, to state the obvious, has been booming. And it has become not only the borough from which people commute into Manhattan, but it has become a place to work, to live, its own culture, its own vitality. And I will tell you, when I walked out onto the parcel that is now 420 Kent, the Three Towers, it was then a movie studio in a parking lot. It was for sale. And all I could think, I was with Charles Marisi, who's been a part of this firm for decades. We looked at each other and we said, this is a remarkable place because Williamsburg is exciting. The views are spectacular. This is where people will want to live. And so we're excited about the final product now 5-6 years later.
Now, I've been reporting on Brooklyn waterfront real estate and Kent Avenue in particular for a really long time. And it was sort of just a real blank slate up until 7-8 years ago. I don't know, could you both talk a little bit about you see this empty movie studio, you see this, empty, plot. Tell us a little bit about your thing about what you guys both wanted to do with this.
Well, let me jump in. Eran will be more poetic in the description. And I think when we got there, there was something of a divide between North Williamsburg and Williamsburg south of the bridge. And it was both an emotional divide and a divide in terms of foot traffic, where people thought about living. Schaefer Landing, the tower just to our south, had been built, but really most of the activity had extended northwards. Two Trees was doing the Domino development, which was well along in its process. And I give them a great deal of credit for having brought scale with a sense of great aesthetics. Now, aesthetics is subjective. Not everybody will like every building, but creativity is integral to good urban planning. And they had brought creativity and also the park, which is great. And so we said, how do we extend that south? How do we integrate an esplanade? And how do we create towers that are not just monolithic, as Eran said, but are interesting, bring angles, views, visual creativity. And I think that was the mission. And I think we accomplished that with Eran's brilliance.
Mm-hmm. Eran, do you want to comment just about how you looked at this empty spot? What were some of your thoughts that went through your mind?
Yeah, first of all, Max, I just want to, I neglected to say, I wanted to describe in the beginning that the building, out of the units, 20% are affordable units under HPD regulation program. It's a mixed building. It's becoming more and more common. I think both Elliot and I are super supportive of that idea of integration of equally positioned affordable units within buildings. And we all sort of examined and witnessed the success of this formula. I remember years ago when this idea was discussed, there was a lot of concern, especially by developers, about the quality of integrations, the social integration between different teams. Actually, super successful. It's such an amazing experience. Like, I usually come on 4th of July and I joined Elliot, at the amenity space, looking at the fireworks across the bridge and the river, and you see really a collection of New Yorkers from very different walks of life, and I think it's a program that works extremely well. To address the idea of the site, it's interesting that if you look at modern cities in the past few decades, there's a tendency to grow outwards. Actually, historically, cities are growing outwards. You have the first ring, second ring, third ring, and New York City has grown outwards from Manhattan, which was the core, based on sort of tracing the line of the trains for many, many years. But what happens in the past decades is human reclaims the waterfront. And that's something that happens not only in New York, it happens around the world. Waterfront was captured through the Industrial Revolution with industries, industrial buildings on the water where ships would come in, and especially here on the East River, come in, enter the bay, and then even continue through Hudson River all the way to Chicago. And therefore, people did not claim that territory, which is, you can say, one of the biggest and best urban amenities for people in general, to be able to be at the waterfront. So Kent is one of those opportunities, which is ongoing, along other neighborhoods, including Queens, to reclaim the waterfront. And it's absolutely an amazing opportunity. So the brilliance of Elliot to be so bullish about that particular site, to me, and now in hindsight, seems sort of a no-brainer, but it's something that we all have to realize it's going to happen in New York and in other cities as well.
Ron, to pick up on something you're saying, and I don't know, Max, I don't want to take this conversation in a direction that you maybe eating up your valuable time, but what Ron said is so fascinating. If you think about it, we have the Brooklyn Navy Yard just to our south, which still has a significant industrial component to it. It's now becoming partly commercial, and so that is but there's a vestige of the past. So the Navy Yard and heavy industry is still there. The other urban planning mistake, the Brooklyn Navy Yard was critical to the growth of the city, but now we're trying to convert that into a more human scaled area for people to use. The mistake that cities made was letting roads be sited along and dividing people from the waterfront. And New York in particular made that mistake. If you think of the West Side Highway, the FDR, and some of the highways in Brooklyn, putting roads right on the waterfront that way is an enormous mistake because it cuts off people from the waterfront. And as Ron said, you want people to have access to the waterfront. So we're trying, it's difficult from an urban planning perspective to reclaim it, but trying to build over them, submerge them, those are endeavors, very expensive, but things that urban planners try to do and should do.
Was that a Robert and Moses thing, or?
Look, Moses obviously has, the interpretation of his development has gone through ups, downs, and sideways, and many aspects of it deserve to be harshly criticized. The one thing I do say in his defense is at least he got things built, and we know that it is not, in this environment in particular, that in and of itself is something to be recognized and applauded. Where he cited certain things is a very different conversation. But I think, as Ron pointed out, we want to reclaim the waterfront. And bit by bit, mayors have sequentially been focusing on that with parks along the waterfront areas. And that's very, very important, and it should be done.
Well, it's very interesting to me that it's also happening at the same time, that you guys are doing 420, that, Two Trees is doing Domino. I think JDS is a development also along the waterfront. I mean, I guess that, you guys were it was in the air that, that there were these reports that these things were happening at the same time.
Well, developers see market signals, and sometimes they all see them at the same time, and that can lead to oversupply. You look at the glut of very high-end condo development at one moment. I think it's because many people saw the success of certain other projects, whether it's 15 CPW or others, and said, aha, let's replicate that. And so too many people follow at one moment, which can lead to, but that's how markets work, oversupply, then you hit a new equilibrium point. But I think people also appreciate that the views of Manhattan from Brooklyn, from Queens, from the New Jersey side are quite spectacular. I mean, you think how many movies have that iconic Manhattan skyline as a backdrop, and there are many locations from which you can appreciate it. But certainly if you're on the Brooklyn side, you look at that, as Ron said, whether it's July 4th or any other moment, you see that skyline and you say, aha, who would not want to wake up and see that, or see that at sunset? And so as somebody who enjoys building, you say that'd be a great place to build residential properties.
Aaron, I did want to get to a question just about the aesthetics in general, and like, does Brooklyn have like its own aesthetic? It seems like the buildings along the waterfront, they're all very distinct. You're doing a project also in Bushwick. Talk to us a little bit about where you think Brooklyn style is at the moment.
It's a very interesting and complex question, Max, because in the jargon of architects, we like to talk about contextual architecture. And I want to touch about this a little bit. When people say contextual, I think the traditional way of looking at this is trying to match in proportion, in material, in fenestrations, and otherwise already existing building within a neighborhood and being part of what was built over time. And there's a lot of value to that, especially in neighborhoods that are historical and they have an inherent character already. So if you look at areas like Dumbo, the Navy Yards, you look at other areas like Awanas, where there was a very distinct, let's say, industrial feeling to them. Being contextual is kind of adopting that idea and bringing it into the future. However, there's some areas in Brooklyn that maybe there's not much of a valuable context to build upon. And therefore, we're asked as architects, what makes our building contextual when there's not much valuable context, if you will? And I think it's a more spiritual contextuality, which relates to the story and narratives. What I mean by that is, I think it's very important for me as an architect and many others, is that the aesthetic of our building possesses or expresses a language that tells a story that is particular to a particular location. And if it tells a story that is inherent or connected to some sort of a human experience or group of people in a particular place, then it becomes the new contextual. For example, one of the thoughts that I had with 420 Kent is what's unique about building 3 towers right on the East River on the waterfront in an area where, before it was plenty vacant and there's the bridges there, et cetera. And I always thought that, if you take any other tower in any other place, would it fit exactly the same way on the riverfront? So I thought about the idea of views. I thought about the idea of the far expression, where you actually experience the building from far away. I thought about the idea even of an iceberg on the riverfront as a sort of a gesture of architectural storyline, and that became my context for the design. So I guess that's a long answer to say, I think areas of Brooklyn definitely has a language that kind of reflects the post-industrial era. And architects, are coming up with different ideas of what that means. And I think in some neighborhoods, we all have to find new context. And we can talk about, for example, our building in Denizen in Bushwick, which to me, the context was the sort of the wealth of history and diversity of the people, rather than the brick on the building. Just the character of the people. In this particular case, we use these mega murals that expresses, the story of the neighborhoods in the building. So to me, it's a lot about narratives and less about brick and mortar.
Now, I wanted to talk also a little bit about the surrounding area, not just the waterfront, but Williamsburg in general. I live in Queens. I took my bike to Williamsburg in the middle of the week, like about a week or so ago. And it was, I would never have known that, we had just suffered this devastating pandemic. There were so many people out, so many people, buzzing around, going into stores, even sitting in a restaurant for lunchtime. In Brooklyn, I was a little bit amazed at how much buzz and traffic there was. Why do you guys think that Williamsburg has been so resilient in this, or has it been? That could just be my impression.
I think your premise, Max, is correct, and for obvious reasons, I traveled out to Williamsburg throughout the pandemic. I'd been there many years prior, as we were in construction, as we were leasing up the project, and then pandemic hit, and I would go out on at least two times a week to see and measure how Williamsburg was faring. And you're correct, it did better than many parts of the city, there was maintained a sense of vitality, which isn't to say that it was as active in the midst of the pandemic as it is either today or was prior to the pandemic. There were ebbs and flows, but nonetheless, it did maintain a greater sense of vitality. The question why, I think there was, in certain purely commercial areas of the city, the city appeared to be deserted at the low point and still is only very slowly coming back. And I hate to pick on this, but you walk up and down 6th Avenue in Manhattan, where you have massive office towers that are not yet populated, it still feels somewhat empty. You have residential areas, the Upper East Side, where there was a greater exodus of people. And so there at the low point was a sense of quiet that was not comforting. But residential areas by and large have come back much more rapidly, of course, than have commercial areas. So even the Upper East Side is now back to some sense of activity. I think in Williamsburg, not as many people departed from the city. And there continued to be street life in terms of restaurants that were providing takeout service or outdoor seating when that became possible. And so I think in some of the residential neighborhoods where there wasn't as significant an exodus, there retained a sense of vitality. Whether it was demographics, whether it was other factors contributed to that is hard to know quite yet. But you're right in your premise. Williamsburg didn't lose its sense of fight and excitement. And I think it has bounced back a bit more rapidly than other parts of the city as a consequence.
Mm-hmm.
I agree. If I may, Max, just add to that, I totally agree with what Elliot said. But to me, as an architect and as an urbanist, it was also a very interesting observation how Williamsburg as a neighborhood was so much more resilient than others. And to me, it's because it's a well-balanced neighborhood. I think it's a healthy neighborhood in that sense. And what I mean by that, Manhattan for so long, and I think still is not a very well-balanced borough. It's a borough that was meant for the sort of the wealthier layer of our society. Those who have second homes that flee the city quite rapidly, and those who doesn't, it was so expensive to live that it was hard to sustain, I think, families and people left to the boroughs. So from that aspect, Williamsburg is much more balanced, I think, in its social economical diversity that allowed people to kind of to stay. The city was still the neighborhood was still very balanced. The other thing is what Elliot alluded to, which is the nature of mixed-use neighborhood. The Upper East Side is predominantly residential. Midtown is office. Williamsburg has a sort of or at least developed a sort of a live, play, work type of feel where people could stay at home, walk, to a small office, still go to the park. And the urban amenities have allowed a more sustainable and more sort of forgiving time through COVID, which you can't say about many other neighborhoods. And I think in that sense, Brooklyn have to be applauded to the way that it's developed in a way that is different, for example, from Queens or the Bronx or even Manhattan, in a way that it became a very balanced, modern neighborhood. And I think that's part of its charm and why people are so drawn to it.
Mm-hmm. Now, let me ask a more practical question. You guys have gotten the ground several years ago. So before there were significant changes in tax rules and before costs shot up, as they are now. Do you think that there's room for even more development? Elliot, do you see yourself developing more in Williamsburg, or do you think that the moment was fleeting and that well, that's a question.
Look, it certainly was not fleeting. There is certainly room for more development, both in Williamsburg and in Brooklyn and in the city writ large. Obviously, it sort of does pose existential questions about urban growth and whether New York, which has lost population for the past couple of years, will somehow regain its role as a magnet for everybody in the world. And I happen to think population loss is a very unfortunate trend line for any urban environment. It doesn't lead to stable revenues if you're thinking of it from a governmental perspective, or to the growth of the sort of creativity that you want. But I think, yes, there's room for growth. There's room along the waterfront. There has to be balance. That is what zoning is all about. And that's what community input is all about, and striking that appropriate balance between permitting the growth that you want and encouraging it to lend the vitality to the city while maintaining the existing nature and feel of the community is a difficult, and as we all know, contentious political debate, but it's something we have to resolve properly to permit continued growth. There's a lumber yard that has been sold south of us that is the Naftali organization is planning to develop. Two Trees is still hoping to develop significantly more units along along the Williamsburg waterfront. There obviously has been enormous growth in downtown Brooklyn. So all of these things, and I do not apologize for being in favor of growth, because I think, as I just said, that is what continues the urban excitement that we all value. So yes, there's room for it. We need to balance many different factors here, but yes, it will continue.
Well, I would be drummed out of journalism if I didn't ask you your thoughts on what happened on the primary on Tuesday. Tell me what's your reaction to?
Well, to state the first obvious point, it's not over yet, in the sense that there, as we all know, there is a redistribution of the second and third place votes, or I guess even farther than that. So it will take a few more days or weeks to resolve this. But I think you can really see in the three leading candidates a spectrum where the apparent winner, Brooklyn Borough President Eric Adams, has been both more vigorous in his articulation of safety and growth as important imperatives for the city. You had Garcia, who was something more of the technocrat, perhaps a less ideological voice, and then Wiley, who was very overt in being a progressive voice, without any, she did not hide her hostility to growth and to development. And so I think the public, to a certain extent, has chosen and has said that we like the Eric Adams view, which says, and my view is no safety, no city, right? You really need safe streets, or else we will not get the people we need to live here and attract the businesses and the tax revenues, et cetera. So I think Eric's view appears to have won, and we have to wait and see how it plays out.
What about with the city council? I mean, there's going to be such an overturn in terms of who's sitting on that council, and it looks like it'll probably be a little bit less pro-development than it is now.
Well, yes, I think the city council has been a reservoir of I don't want to say hostility, that may be too strong, but maybe not, hostility towards both rezonings and towards growth and development. And I fear what I call the politics of stagnation. And the status quo is always the most powerful force out there. Those who are currently in a neighborhood can and often do, unfortunately, oppose any change. And city council members often reflect that consensus in their community without recognizing what might be. And so I think we need to overcome the politics of stagnation. We need to embrace the possibilities of change. And I think the Industry City example is perhaps the easiest one. What should have been, in my view, the least controversial of the rezonings that was proposed, because it seemed to present pure upside, and yet it found it. And so I think, yes, you're correct. The city council needs to, I think, confront this issue and look back to prior years where you got speakers, whether it's Peter Vallone, or whom I think of fondly, who would take a broader perspective in terms of the needs of the urban environment, in terms of supporting redevelopment packages. And so I hope we can overcome this, and there will be some sort of conversation between the mayor, presumably Eric Adams, and the city council on these issues.
Mm-hmm. Now, I wanted to, touch on something that you just mentioned. I think your previous answer was loss of population. That seems to me a really big problem for the city. What are some of the ways to reverse that? Can you both talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, first of all, just to add to the last question, I do agree with Elliot. I think this election especially is pivoting around three topics, clearly, which is safety, growth, and affordability and equality. These are three pivot aspects, and different candidates put themselves in basically different positioning of what's more important than the other, right? Is affordability more important than growth, or growth more important than safety, or vice versa? Where it seems like normalcy or balanced cities are a win-win situation where all three are important, all three are achieved together through smart policy. I think that what we've seen in the past decades is communities feel that no matter what, growth is against their livelihood, growth is against affordability, growth is against equality, which is quite unfortunate because cities that are not growing are dying. I mean, we can look at extreme cases of old European cities and Venice and other cities. If the city doesn't grow, it dies. And I think that we've missed for a long time the ability to articulate politically and otherwise the fact that no, we can win all of them. We can continue to grow and create better, more affordable, more sort of equitable cities if we do it correctly. To me, I must be an optimist as an architect who is believing in cities and the growth of cities. If I'm not an optimist, I could go home and stop doing what I do. And therefore, I believe that there's no other better formula in the near and far future for humans than living in cities. There's peaks and balances where we say, oh, we're tired of the city. We need to go out and get more space. But the long run is we all understand the fragility of our balanced planet and the fact that the only way to sustain ourselves over time is to consolidate humans in cities and let nature otherwise and the outskirts be more natural, give it back to Mother Earth. It's much more sustainable to live in city because the infrastructure is there. You don't have to recreate it. You don't have to drag electrical lines and plumbing and water and otherwise to remote places. So there's no doubt that this is the future in my mind. The question is how long the balance of COVID would bring people back. It's funny. A lot of the people who are fleeing to Westchester and Jersey and other places in the suburbs, and they're saying there are bidding wars on every house. Somebody sell a house and go somewhere. And I think a lot of these people that sell a house there come back to the city. There's a lot of empty nesters who raise their kids in the suburbs. This is the best time to sell my house. For a young family from New York who's fleeing from the city, and they're coming back and buying an apartment or renting an apartment here. So I think if you look at the statistics, I maybe correct me, Elliot, I think the number is like 450 people or so left Manhattan through COVID. About 250 or 280,000 have come back already, and I think the numbers will kind of align towards the end of September.
Let me just first, having just listened to Eran articulate that so spectacularly, it's one of the reasons it was so much fun to work with you was that you have these insights and this sort of historical and deeper understanding of the ebbs and flows of both urban life and politics, and so it's a real joy. Let me pick up on a couple of things you've said. Yes, you're absolutely correct. People are returning to the city. You can see it in all sorts of data, whether it's the leasing data, the people who are purchasing, whether it's how heavy rush hour traffic is, transportation numbers. It's all encouraging in the sense of the return. Max, in answer to your question, what can we do to build that urban context that Eran described? We need to invest. I've always said the key to housing is transportation. Transportation permits people to move around a very densely populated center without feeling constrained and without getting frustrated. And that's why urban transportation systems must be at the core of what we do. In addition, parks. If you don't have open spaces, then people will end up feeling claustrophobic and will not wish to be in that environmental context. And so New York has done well in some ways with parks. And I think to bring back 420, that's why the Esplanade and the access to the waterfront is so important, why Domino Park, just north of the Williamsburg Bridge, are so critical. You think of the major parks, whether they're in Brooklyn or the Bronx or Manhattan or Queens, those parks are the center of so much activity and living around them. So we have to invest once again in our transportation infrastructure and in our parks. And we also have to be smart about our upzoning. Upzoning will permit the construction of housing in areas serviced by those transportation nodes that will then permit people to live here affordably. And to come back to your point, Max, I do my sort of focus group studies, not formally, but with kids, college kids. Where do you want to move when you graduate from college or get your PhD or get your law degree or business degree, whatever it may be? And if New York is not on the list of the top 2 or 3 cities, I worry. At this point, we still are. I don't know if we will be replaced by a Miami, Austin, Nashville. I don't think so. But we need to make sure that we continue to be at the very top of where kids want to move because that inflow of talent is what, as Iran said, if you're not growing, you're dying. A city must have that inflow of population and talent.
Well, it's also probably a question of affordability as well.
Absolutely.
And I mean, is that what the city should be hoping for? Is that there's like a dip in prices that way?
I'll tell you something interesting, Max. And I used to say this not facetiously, even to my friends in the real estate community. I used to say a real estate crisis is critical to the future of New York. Every 10 years, we need to have a new equilibrium point, because if prices continue to increase, compound interest being the eighth wonder of the world, if prices go up 3% every year and outpace inflation and wages, eventually we do become unaffordable. We need a reset. And one of the reasons there has been this tremendous flow back into the city in the past 4 or 5 months is because prices did drop. And that 10, 15% drop in rents across the board, whether it's in gross rents or net effective rents, concessions, whatever form it takes, has drawn many people back who could not earlier have afforded a particular apartment, or else now they perceive it as being more affordable, and so they're returning. And so yes, affordability is key, but in the long run, understand what drives affordability is supply. As I said, you can't repeal the laws of economics. Supply and demand work, and there will be equilibrium points, and if we want to maintain affordability and grow, we need supply. So in other words, we need to encourage construction of housing, and even though I have been very supportive, both when I was in government and now in the private sector, of government programs that assist through tax benefits or through, we have, as Iran mentioned, 187 inclusionary units at 420. At the end of the day, in the long run, the private sector has to build units by the tens of thousands to keep New York City growing, and that will only happen if zoning permits it to happen. So we need to have smart zoning that permits people to build those tens of thousands of units that in the long run keep the price down, because without that incremental supply, prices will go up.
Well, that seems like why the primary is such a critical question. I've been covering the last city council and the last administration, and real estate is just persona non grata with so much of the city council. And the sides just don't talk to each other. And I'm wondering whether there's any sort of like bridge of communication between those people, just in terms of the real estate people and progressives in government, and whether those questions of zoning can be bridged at all. What do you think about that, Elliot?
Well, I hope so. The premise of your question is absolutely correct. The real estate community, the word developer is anathema to the political active class. If one goes to Albany, which still matters a great deal to New York, because when we were in Albany, we used to refer to New York as a subservient level of government. It was sort of the Albany way of saying, hey, you still report to us. And Albany sets the rules in the long run. And up in Albany, as in the city council in New York City, there is a confirmed prejudice against those who develop, based upon the belief that developers have made so much money sort of improperly. Now, putting aside the ethical questions of what return should be and how you make money and all that, that ignores the reality that without the development that we've seen in New York over the last 30 years, New York would not have its iconic status. If all the projects that people opposed, and if you go back historically, whether it was Rockefeller Center, Lincoln Center, the UN, there were opposition voices to every one of these, just as there have been to the larger proposals these days. If those projects had not been built, New York would not be what it is. And so I'm a confirmed believer that these projects encourage the urban life that we all appreciate. We need to make that case, not because it's a matter of making money, but because it is a matter of creating and perpetuating the sort of urban existence that we have. And so, yes, there needs to be communication. The real estate community has lost the more meaningful editorial boards. The New York Times editorial board has, I think, a grievous error. They opposed the Amazon headquarters location to New York City. I just was mystified by that, and I think you can look at that decision as a pivot point for at least this last chapter of our politics. And I think we need to have the conversation with the local elected leaders and explain to them how these projects will improve the quality of life, not only of their communities, but also the entire urban existence.
I feel like the ghost of Robert Moses is haunting this conversation because all of the well, first off, you mentioned parks, and how we certainly understood the importance of that, and the big projects that certainly generated a lot of controversy.
Right.
I did want to get back to the parks question and the open space question, because I agree with you that that's like a very critical component of any neighborhood and any urban landscape. Eran, tell us a little bit about, I don't know, your take on this in Williamsburg, and your take on this in Williamsburg.
Well, first of all, the issue of affordability, I just want to touch upon the fact that the way that the administration have dealt with affordability is a numbering game, each administration trying to reach a higher number, and not necessarily as a quality game. It's something that needs to change, because it's not just about how many affordable units we build, because if we build them in less desirable location, the outskirts, create communities that are detached, that's not helping anyone. It's how and where you build them and what the quality that is being built. So that's number one. And that's why I am a very big supportive of mixed affordability within every neighborhood in the city. So affordability is not just in the outskirts of Queens and Bronx, but you can have affordable apartments everywhere, including prime neighborhoods in Manhattan and Williamsburg and other places. But we have to find formulas that incentivize developers to build them, because otherwise, who's going to build them? The second point that I want to make is affordability is not just housing. What about affordable retail? What about creating more equitable public realm that includes affordable retail? You can move to an affordable housing apartment in a neighborhood that the supermarket is way too expensive. How is that helping? We need to come out, and I'm very curious about the fact that people are not discussing it enough. I've actually created a movie now about the Flower District. I don't know if you had a chance to see it, that talks about this whole idea of the ground floor and transitioning the ground floor from another line item in the Excel sheets of developer as an income producing element to a ground floor that is actually an improving of the public realm, indoor and outdoor, not just by creating parks and open space, but by creating and monitorizing diversity of retails that would allow for local businesses to flourish and have more affordability for the retail, as well as community facilities, educational facilities, and such. To that end, if we start thinking about the ground floor as an element where the communities can participate in not only orchestrating, but having stake, then we will create more diverse neighborhoods. Then return will be more desirable, which in return would increase the value of everything that is built above. So in a way, the formula of development that says, if we're gonna look at the ground floor retail or ground floor in general, not as a giveaway, but as a break-even element that allows for affordability, we're going to get better neighborhoods that would improve the the math on the upper floors, whatever you build. I just want to give an example. We've done a master plan in Queens, in Astoria. Recently, it's still in the process of approval, but got a lot of positive feedback from the community, called Innovation Queens, where we designed 5 city blocks, about 2.5 million square foot of development. The plan was rejected a few times before we came in with a totally different approach to it. We said, how about we take 25% of the footprint of the land, the private land of the developer, and we give it back as diversity of park and public spaces to the community. We're going to take that FAR, put it at the top. So there's no loss to the developer. It's actually a win-win. And then the ground floor would be shared by conversation with the community boards and other stakeholders and partners to really cater an active and equitable ground floor that serves the entire neighborhood at large. This kind of formulas is what I think the narrative should be in the future. If you go to any community board meeting, it's only about height and density, as if there's nothing else in life that is important. We have to educate people what to fight for. We need to fight for better educational facilities, more affordable retail, more opportunities for financial and economical development. And elements like height, for example, becomes less important to me because the density is the life, as Elliot says, is the life for future cities.
I think Aron's making a great point. We ignore the activity at street level too often. And that is, during the pandemic, in particular, what was most missing when one walked the streets of New York City. That energy, the city that never sleeps, this notion of 24 hours a day, people going into a store, whether it's a grocery store, whether it's a food establishment, whatever it may be, this notion of constant vitality is missing. And I think Aron is correct. We need to think about how do we create those, at a minimum, corridors of commercial activity. And yes, I did watch your video about the Flower District and whether we can recreate sort of those interior spaces between buildings as parks or community spaces. It's a brilliant idea. Increasing those areas for communal activity would help regenerate and regrow this urban context.
Aaron, what's the name of the documentary? Because I have not seen this, but I'm fascinated.
That's okay. It's called Beyond the Street, and the idea is it's a 3-minute short movie about the Flower District. The reason I picked the Flower District is one, it's next to our office, so I walked. I know every building in it. The other is a poetic idea of a place that used to be a center to sell flowers, a very vibrant pedestrian neighborhood where it was also a mixed-use neighborhood. I don't know if people know that. There were residential, hotels, factories, and it was just an amazing neighborhood. It was dilapidated because it was taken over by cars, traffic, and the public experience has been reduced to the narrow sidewalk and fairly retail. And what if we can bring it back by expanding it into the inner courtyard? But that idea of the Flower District can be done in many other places in New York. And it's really an idea in principle that privately owned area at the ground floor could be shared and become public in return for benefits, if it's height or FAR. And this would be a major win-win situation. We can continue to grow. The public sector, who's, by the way, if without developers, we have no cities. So people have still the illusion that cities are being built by government. We've seen the fail of government facilities, NYCHA and others, in being able to build and maintain neighborhoods. The private sector is the only one who puts their kind of the risk online to build neighborhoods. We have to be supportive of that. And that narrative needs to change dramatically. But the win-win situation would really allow us to live in a better city while maintaining the growth.
Ron, you mentioned NYCHA, and obviously NYCHA is a very difficult issue to confront. The quality of the housing stock is deteriorated. It is vast, both in terms of the number of units, in terms of the number of people, the capital that will be required to bring back that housing stock to levels of habitability that right now it often doesn't meet. And I can tell you, having been in government, that there are some good ideas out there, some of which are politically difficult, and even the current mayor tried to confront it without a whole lot of success. But one of them really is upzoning the areas, or building significantly more and new housing in the property that is encompassed by NYCHA right now, and permitting those who are now living in old, dilapidated housing to transfer into the new housing, but increase the number of units we have there by a multiple of 2 or 3, because we are desperately in need for this housing, permitting some percentage of it either to be market rate, adding the retail, because for reasons that maybe have a historical answer that I don't need to get into right now, there's an absence of retail in most of the NYCHA housing units. We can bring retail to it, add units at the top that could help support a rebuild so we get entirely new housing stock. This would be a 30-year process. This is not a one mayoral term endeavor. This is a long-term, multi-decade effort, but you could bring tens, hundreds of thousands of units to the city, new housing stock, better quality, retail, reintegrate massive areas of the city that are right now really falling apart. And even, as you've written, Aron, redesign the streetscapes and the street lines, which often right now in NYCHA areas were designed, unfortunately, initially, whether this is a Moses issue or not, I don't even know, to sort of curtail access in and out. And so we could do so much in our urban landscape if we did that. NYCHA is an opportunity. We view it as as a problem to be avoided. It's really an opportunity if you embrace it.
It's a very interesting concept. I'm curious, has this won a lot of converts? Or are there people who are talking about this, Eran? Or
Oh, well, it's interesting. We just released the video 2 or 3 days ago. It's already been seen by thousands and thousands of people. I'll be happy to share it, Max. We've got amazing response. And frankly, the reason and partially of the timing, because I've been sort of percolating with this idea for a few years, is I want to communicate this idea to the general public, not architects and urban planners necessarily, but people need to see it in order to understand the potential. As part of the process that I've been going with neighborhoods, including, by the way, in Queens and in others, when I work with community boards, is I want to be able to articulate to them the things, the real giving that they can get. And unfortunately, it's not done well enough, because we architects talk about FAR and we talk about density and parking spots. That's all good and well. But besides one's own apartment, the urban giving, the urban amenities that city can give to a person for free or for less is what makes our life amazing in the cities. Otherwise, you're right. Why would we spend time living in a small apartment if we can go to the suburbs or get a bigger house? The urban amenities is the narrative that everybody needs to talk about. So I created this movie that really visualizes a step-by-step, an example of how a simple zoning change could create a major contribution to the public realm. And I think there's many ideas like that. But I'll be happy to share it with you, Max. And the more people would see it, the more pressure we can get from the bottom up to our politicians and urban planners to start thinking creatively about the future. This is not a time to go back to the comfort of the old formulas. It's just, this is not what we need to do right now. And whoever is going to be the new mayor and the new council, if they're not going to start thinking creatively about those elements, we're really doomed.
Now, we did get a few questions from viewers that I want to get to, and they're about a topic that I wanted to talk about, which is transportation, some of them. But before we get to them, I did want to ask you both just one question, piggybacking on something that, Eran, you've worked in a lot of cities beyond just, New York. Just to get to a little bit of, what are some of the things, what are some of the cities that are doing development right now? Who are the people who are, making these projects happen and really pushing these things along and making the process easier?
Well, we are working right now at 12 different countries around the world, in Europe, in Asia, even in Russia, South America, Central America. And in most of our projects that we do right now are large urban scale projects. So we've kind of rapidly shifted the company's focus beyond a single building into the impact on neighborhoods, et cetera. And it's quite stunning to me. And by the way, these are countries that have reached out to us to come in and help with what they're looking for, which is to balance density and quality of life. Everybody is talking about the same thing. I don't care if you're in Rotterdam or in Moscow or in Buenos Aires. Everybody's dealing with the same topics. How can we continue to increase density while maintaining people's quality of life and equality? What I see is in the government, I see much more attention to the issue of public realm. I see cities that have particular governing body that is just assigned to the public realm and the quality of public realm and developing new ideas. I was amazed, for example, was invited by a government body in Belgium to hear my opinion about ideas of how they creatively can navigate between the private investor and the quality of public realm. They come to us. So the world is looking at New York to give answers. And yet I feel we're so much behind in our attention to come up with creative solutions that are new. I have to say, the glass half full. There's no other city that have managed to create a process that is as dynamic and quick as New York City. There are many projects in Europe that would take 10 to 15 years to be developed, where in New York you can come in, buy land, and still, for the most part, be able to build in 4 or 5 years a significant project. We have more diversity than other countries in so many ways. We have, I believe, more equitable society than many others. So when we look outside, I would say we need to feel good about ourselves, but we need to learn that without an investment in creative policies, we're not going to be able to move forward.
Let me pick up on two things, Aron. One, Europe has a history that goes back many more millennia than we do. So their time horizons tend to be a little bit different, and so one has to understand that. I like the optimism, and the affirmative nature through the prism through which you view where we are in New York. I would add one caveat. I think the mistake New York has made, the mistake that urban politics often lapses into, is permitting the most local voice to have a veto over particular projects, rather than permitting the larger public good to be evaluated. And I alluded to Peter Vallone earlier, who when he was city council speaker, he made sure that public land use decisions were ultimately made with a view for the entire city, not the particular councilman or councilwoman who may be subject to political pressures that are understandable and not wrong, but have a more localized impact and focal point. So I think we need to expand the decision making to a point where the citywide elected officials think about the larger public good, rather than, as I said, the politics of stagnation, which is obviously a loaded word, that can somehow and often overcome a particular decision for a particular site. And I think Industry City is perhaps the easiest and best example of that, where certainly the city would have won at every level had that process and had that project and development plan been permitted to go forward.
I agree in the sense, Elliot, I'm sorry to interrupt, Max, that the lack of leadership.
Yeah.
Leadership is not always pleasant, but leadership is the ability to come up with policies that are inclusive, that are smart, that takes cues from communities and the benefits of the public, the general good, and then have the courage and the force to proceed. And I think we're in a gridlock, as you described very well, Max, between communities' voice who are resent, and tired of the old formulas, city planning who's afraid of the politicians, and which creates stagnation because there's a lack of leadership that would propel us forward, and everybody's sort of relying or moving out of fear about what the others say, as opposed to come up with a progressive new plan that is really hearing the voices, but charging forward with sort of a new direction.
Elliot, can I ask you, would you ever consider developing outside of the city?
Sure. I mean, look, unlike Aron, who's a multinational, obviously, we just heard he's been on every continent. I think he's building in Antarctica next week. We're a family business, and consequently, I like to be active where we truly understand the urban environment in which I've lived, in which I've grown up, and the same with when my dad was here. So we have been presented opportunities, whether it was Austin or San Francisco, and shied away from them just because I don't have the infrastructure of a Related or a Tishman Speyer that they've developed into vast organizations. And so we're a family business. We usually do one project or two projects at a time. Having said that, we're building in Jersey City right now. Now that's part of the metro economic environment. So I think that really is part of New York City. We are active in Washington, D.C., but we are primarily Washington and the New York metro environment. And we're active. We have 4 ongoing projects right now. So yes, we would look at other sites, but because of the way we operate and function, we like to have a very hands-on, direct involvement in everything we do. We develop our own sites. And so that has meant, by and large, we have maintained our presence to New York and Washington in the New York environment.
Okay, well, I did want to ask a question about the ferries, given that 420 is on the water. I also wanted to ask about 420 Kent and whether that had any cannabis connection. but I will. We did get a question about the ferries. All right, what the hell, Elliot? I'll ask you the cannabis question.
Right.
Has there been any anybody who's made that connection?
Absolutely. Look, just so it's clear, that's not why it's called 420 Kent. I don't want anybody to think. As we all know, addresses are ordained by the lot maps, and so it just happened to be the number. I will tell you that the first marketing meeting, the marketers kind of looked at the number and said, "Gee, do you understand what that means?" They thought I was perhaps too old to understand the illusion, and I disabused them of that fact. Not surprisingly, we've had contact from a number of companies now that the laws have changed in the state, and there is within a year or so there will be the opportunity to have retail sale of cannabis. We've a number of companies have reached out to us about our retail space and said they're interested because they think the number obviously is perhaps a good advertising tool for them.
Okay, well, we won't end on quite that note, even though we are out of time. So here's a question from Scott Baker. Should Brooklyn waterfront developers pay part of the subsidy for new ferry terminals that make development in these areas so desirable? Another controversial question we can end on. So, Elliot, do you have any thoughts on that?
Look, I haven't thought about it in with respect to the ferries in particular, but I'll give you a metaphor. First of all, the ferry comes in right at 420. It's obviously of enormous benefit to anybody who lives within walking distance of that ferry line. Transportation, as I said earlier, is the heart and soul of making urban life possible. The metaphor I would allude to is in the Hudson Yards, where part of the funding for the extension of the 7 line was paid for by those who were developing the sites there. The additional FAR was added, taxes were imposed, the revenue was going to expand the transportation because there's an uptick in property values. Conceptually, absolutely. There is a burden sharing, and that is the way things can and should be done. Now, we also pay all our property taxes. We pay many other taxes, transfer taxes. When you sell a piece of property, there's been an uptick in value. Theoretically, some of it is paid back to the city in a transfer tax that goes to the MTA. So this concept is there. It's correct. It's good economics, and it's what helps the urban environment grow.
All right. Well, as I said, we are out of time, but I did want to thank you both for a really interesting conversation. I feel like we could talk for a lot longer. Someday I'm going to have Robert Caro on one of these things, and I'll invite you both to join me. We talk about Robert Moses for for hours. I could do hours. But Elliot, former Governor Elliot Spitzer, head of Spitzer Enterprises, Eran Chen of ODA. I'd like to thank you both so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great conversation. Thanks.
And I'd like to thank our friends at Burden for today's sponsorship. Thank you so much.
Dad, Mom had such a great vision for the company. I don't know that I can keep it going.
Amy, your mother worked with Burden to develop a plan. Don't worry.
Life in business can be hard.